Thank you so much for the welcome to your Earth Alive forum. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be joining you online. Daja Hao, I should say in some of the languages of the Pacific, Bula Vinaka Talofa Aloha. Of course, there are many languages in the Pacific. In fact, the Pacific region is our most diverse part of the world. Its human population is the most diverse, but also, of course, its natural world, the natural world of the Pacific, is the most biodiverse part of our Earth. And so I want to talk today about the importance of preserving and sustaining the Pacific, a safe place for our natural environment and a safe place for our food and for our people to live in peace. I had the great privilege of working for 4 years in Beijing as the representative of the Pacific Islands Forum. That is the regional organization of the Pacific Islands countries. And working for the Pacific Island countries was not just a privilege, but it was a great eye-opener for me. It opened my eyes to see the world in a different way. I grew up as an urban citizen of a developed, rich country, Australia, and working for island countries, developing countries, who live very close to nature, was a very different experience for me. And it opened my eyes to looking at our region, the Pacific region, in a different way. Working for the Pacific Islands made me appreciate the huge challenges that these small countries face in development. Development has been very successful in many of the large countries of East Asia, and we all, of course, applaud the great success of the Chinese development of the last 40 years. But actually the challenges facing the small island countries in development are so much greater because they're so isolated. They have such huge environmental challenges, difficulties in reaching markets, to reach international markets, and of course a lack of human resources as well. And so most of these small island countries are very dependent on a small number of industries. And the big industry that people in the developing countries of the Pacific rely upon is the fisheries industry. They really need to earn income from their fishery resources. They're very lucky in most cases to have large ocean areas that are their exclusive economic zones, but also, of course, they face a number of environmental problems. There are challenges facing the fisheries from the changing environment and also from illegal overfishing as well from some of the bigger countries in the region. And not only is it important for these Pacific Island countries to be able to export their fishery resources and to host fishing boats from other countries as well to fish in their waters and to receive license fees. But really critically, we need the countries of the region, the markets of the region, to have confidence in the safety of the fishery resource. The seafood we know from the Pacific is pure and is safe to eat. And that's fundamentally important that we preserve that and protect that reputation for the seafood of the Pacific. And so one of the big challenges that we have had in the Pacific actually for decades, all through the Cold War, were nuclear tests that took place in the Pacific by countries such as the United States and France, and the radioactive fallout from those nuclear tests was quite dangerous to the people and to the fishery resource of the Pacific. And actually, the concerns about nuclear testing really drove a sense of Pacific community. It brought the Pacific Islands together. It was one of the key issues that led to the formation of the Pacific Islands Forum, the regional organization that I used to work for, this concern about the Pacific must not be a place that is endangered by nuclear testing, and it must not be a place that is endangered by geopolitical contest by bigger powers. So given the history of the experience that the people of the Pacific have had with nuclear testing and radioactive pollution, it is understandable, I think, that there is considerable concern and worry about the wastewater from the Fukushima reactor in Japan, which of course had a meltdown a number of years ago, and where a lot of the wastewater that has been used to cool that reactor is now being considered to be discharged, to be put into the Pacific Ocean. This is naturally, understandably, raising a lot of concerns amongst the community in the Pacific. Now, this is a real dilemma for us, I think, because while there is very strong concern about the nuclear industry in the Pacific Islands, there is equally a lot of concern about other energy sources that contribute to climate change, because climate change is such a major challenge for the Pacific Island countries. So balancing the ability of the bigger countries to invest in nuclear power against people's concerns about nuclear waste with people's concerns about other energy sources is a difficult dilemma. It's a difficult problem. It's almost what we might call in English a wicked problem, one that is very difficult to find the right balance. But I want to make a suggestion from my experience. I have worked in the past, before I worked for the Pacific Island countries, I worked for my home state in Australia of Tasmania, which also relies very much on its food and fisheries industries. And we had an experience with Japanese consumers that I want to talk to you about today. So at that time, 10 years ago, when I was a senior advisor to the Tasmanian government, actually it was more than 10 years ago, it was 20 years ago, I'm making a mathematical mistake. 20 years ago, the Japanese, big Japanese importer companies such as Mitsui and others wrote to us in Tasmania, and they said, because your seafood and your beef and your other agricultural products are of such high quality, our consumers value their purity, and we would ask you to take a precautionary approach with new technologies such as gene technology. So the Japanese companies that were importing Tasmanian food asked us, the Tasmanian government, to not use GMOs, genetically modified organisms. This was a request from Japan to protect the reputation of Tasmania's food products. So we went and asked scientists to advise us about the safety of genetically modified organisms, and we found that the scientists weren't yet ready to give us a 100% answer, but they thought that probably the gene technology was in accordance with the standards of the time. Rather like today, the Japanese government has asked the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency, will it be safe for them to discharge the wastewater from Fukushima into the Pacific? And the UN agency has said, well, it does meet our standards. So we were in the same situation in Tasmania 20 years ago, where, yes, we could have followed the scientific advice and said, well, we will go ahead with this new technology. But actually the Japanese buyers were asking us not to. So I tell you this story because we made a decision 20 years ago in Tasmania not to proceed with gene technology in agriculture, purely to preserve the reputation of the food as being pure and natural. And this met with the approval of the export markets. And so I'm giving you this story as an example of how Japan today might also take a precautionary approach. It might think about, well, actually, how does the rest of the world look at this question? So just as 20 years ago, the Japanese food companies were asking us in Tasmania to take a precautionary approach and not to embrace this new gene technology, I would suggest that today the Japanese government could take a precautionary approach as well, since the fishing industry of Japan and the fishing industry of the Pacific is not comfortable with the discharge of radioactive wastewater into the Pacific. Take the precautionary approach and find another solution. And I think for all of us in the Pacific region, there's a lesson here about taking a precautionary approach, because we do need to be very careful about preserving the fishing industry and the fishery resource of the Pacific. This is the world's greatest fishery resource. For food security in China, Japan, the countries of the whole of the Pacific Rim, we all rely upon these resources of the Pacific. So not only do we need to keep them safe, but we also need to keep it sustainable. So it's up to all of us to help protect the fishery resource through not overfishing, through not damaging the environment, through addressing climate change. These are all big problems that we all share. I'm sure you all know about the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis that is facing the Pacific Island countries. And while these are small countries and they may seem a long way away, they are actually the warning sign. They're actually the warning to all of us about what is coming in the future if we don't, as a global community, address the climate crisis, because already some of these small island countries are finding natural disasters, rising sea levels, damage to the water supply, risks to food security are already at crisis levels in some of these islands. This is our collective future as a global community unless we address the climate problem. When people visit the beautiful Pacific Islands, what they see is paradise on Earth, but really paradise on Earth is under threat. And so it is our responsibility collectively, all of us as global citizens, but particularly those of us who come from the Pacific region, both big and small countries. We really do need to work together as a community to address the risks to this region, the risks to its environment, and the risks to our food supply. I'm very confident that we can do this. We can see the dramatic shift to renewable energy, to electric vehicles that we're seeing in the streets of Chinese cities. We're seeing the technological shift is starting to happen. It needs to escalate. It needs to speed up. And we need to see by the middle of this century that we really have climate change under control. So let me conclude just by noting that in the Pacific Islands, people live in small villages, but in each village, everyone has the responsibility to look after the village and to keep it safe. And we now, I think, live in one Earth village. We're all responsible for each other. Thank you very much. 谢谢你。